This is a sloth, and this is a bear. Wait, no, that's actually still a sloth. Today, the most dangerous thing a sloth can do is miss a branch and fall. They move so slowly that moss literally grows on their fur, and their primary defense mechanism is just hoping no one notices that they're extremely easy to eat. But back in the Pleistocene, sloths were not the victims, but instead were the ones victimizing. They grew to the size of elephants. They dug tunnels through solid rock, and they were stronger than most gorillas. What happened to the modern sloths that made them so pitiful? What threats back then were forcing the sloths to evolve so large? And what made this giant bear sloth eventually go extinct? The giant bear sloth, also known as Megatherium, was in fact mega. It weighed up to 4 tons, which is heavier than your car, heavier than a hippo, and about half as heavy as a Tyrannosaurus rex. Modern sloths are about 11 pounds. These prehistoric sloths were genuinely 1,000 times heavier. If this guy fell on you, you would be, well, you wouldn't be anything anymore. But the most terrifying part wasn't just the weight, it was the reach. Unlike modern sloths, which are stuck hugging branches for dear life, Megatherium was a ground sloth. It didn't need to climb trees because it could just stand up and look down on them. When this creature reared up on its hind legs, it stood nearly 20 feet tall. That's tall enough to look into a second-story window. To be honest, even if they did want to climb the trees, it would be like putting an elephant on a tree branch. Rest in peace, that tree. So, okay, this sloth was absolutely massive, but why did it get this way? Isn't the whole strategy of a sloth to camouflage itself and hide? Being the size of an elephant doesn't really let you hide very well. Yeah, this is genuinely what's happening. Well, the giant sloths took a slightly different strategy than normal sloths. They were still slow, but during the Pleistocene, things like saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears were running around. If you are a slow-moving herbivore in a world filled with hypercarnivores, you have 2 options: hide or get swole. By becoming massive, Megatherium effectively became uneatable. A predator looks at a 4-ton wall of muscle and bone armor and realizes it's just not worth the fight. It's the same logic elephants use today. Being big is energy expensive, but it buys you immunity from almost anything. Even if they're not actively hunting other animals, their size is just for defense. This would make sense. Since you're as slow as a sloth, you're probably not good at chasing things down, but good at standing your ground. And if your prey is a mobile plant, you can chase that down even at 1 mile an hour. Just like modern sloths, these guys were herbivores, but they weren't eating high-calorie energy bars. They were eating leaves, twigs, and scrub. This stuff is garbage in terms of nutrition. To get enough energy to survive, you need a massive gut to ferment all that plant matter. Basically, Megatherium was a walking fermentation tank. Modern sloths have this too. It takes them a month to digest a single meal. But because they are small, they have 0 energy left over to move. Megatherium was so big that its massive metabolic furnace generated enough heat and energy to let it actually do things. They were still definitely slow, but likely at least a singular mile an hour, versus modern sloths being genuinely 0.2 miles an hour. It still couldn't chase prey or flee predators, but enough to attack and hold its ground. So how strong were they actually? You know how modern sloths have that death grip where their tendons lock into place, allowing them to hang from a branch for hours without using any muscle energy? They can die completely and remain hanging there. It's why modern sloths are still dangerous to get close to, even if they can't actually chase you, because if they grab you once, they won't let go. So imagine that grip on a 1,000 times heavier sloth. Megatherium didn't just have strong arms, it could terraform the entire environment. Since they were too heavy to climb trees to get the fresh leaves at the top, they adopted a much more violent solution. They would simply grab the trunk of the tree and rip the entire tree to the ground. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, as they actually fit a weird ecological niche that basically no one else was strong enough to fill. By pulling down trees, it prevented forests from becoming closeted systems. Every tree it damaged or toppled let light actually reach the ground, triggering bursts of grasses, shrubs, and fast-growing plants. Over time, this created a constantly shifting mosaic of open patches, regrowth, and mature stands rather than a stable, dense forest where all the tall trees block photosynthesis from everything below. If a saber-toothed cat tried to jump a Megatherium, it wasn't dealing with a slow, groggy swipe. It would shatter your ribcage and collapse your lungs in one hit. Megatherium was stronger than any bear, at least any bear that exists today. Even the strongest bear today, the polar bear, would get absolutely annihilated by Megatherium. 1,500 pounds for the polar bear versus the 8,000 pound sloth means the polar bear would get crushed instantly. Megatherium would crush any modern day gorilla, and a gorilla's only potential would be to use its intelligence as an advantage. And that advantage would be realizing, wait, this guy isn't very fast, but he'll delete me instantly if I get close. I'm just going to avoid him completely. The only things that might compare to a Megatherium are elephants, and the strongest ones might be able to beat the sloth in brute pushing force. With grip or pull strength though, it's likely Megatherium was still stronger, simply because elephants can't really pull that easily. Megatherium was really the only animal that had manipulative forelimbs, meaning an actual arm-based force on a giant mass body. Things like mammoths and elephants definitely can't grab or stand on two limbs. Even the short-faced bear only weighed about 2,200 pounds, which is skinny compared to these thick sloths. These sloths would have been apex predators, if they were predators. But is this not overkill? Do you really need to be built this thick just to eat some leaves? Do you really need to be 4 times heavier than the biggest bears just to fight one off? Well, yes. Yes, you do. The threats back then were so vicious that being big wasn't actually enough. You had to be indestructible. And that brings us to a part of the sloth anatomy that sounds completely fake: the armor. See, if you bite a modern sloth, it's soft. It's basically a bag of bones and wet moss. Megatherium had what were called osteoderms, and they weren't just some fat sloth variant. Basically, they had tiny, marble-sized bones embedded directly inside their skin. They were literally wearing armor underneath that shag carpet fur. So imagine you are a saber-toothed cat. You sneak up on this mountain of meat. You go for the throat, and instead of sinking into flesh, your jaw slams into a hidden wall of calcium. These cats' bites are strong, but not strong enough to crush bone. While you're wondering how you just broke your teeth, the giant sloth now has ample time to turn around and crush you completely. The armor wasn't actually a full covering, and most of the strength was just from the raw size of the sloth itself. Predators don't hunt fair fights. And with this much mass, Megatherium made every fight unfair, in its favor. It was a defense strategy called passive tanking. They didn't even need to be fast, because biting them just didn't work. Oddly enough, Megatherium wasn't the only giant sloth. This was the Lestodon. For years, geologists in South America kept finding these massive, smooth, perfectly round tunnels drilled into solid rock and compacted earth. And not like little rabbit holes. These were tunnels large enough for a grown human to walk through comfortably without ducking. For decades, no one knew what made them. They didn't look like water erosion, and they didn't look like volcanic tubes. Some people even suggested ancient aliens. But then they looked closer at the walls and saw the scratch marks. Massive, parallel gouges cut into the stone. It turns out sloths did this. These are called Paleo burrows. Imagine you are a predator chasing a sloth, and suddenly it just disappears into the side of a mountain. You peek your head in, and all you see is infinite darkness and the sound of a 2-ton animal sharpening its claws on the walls. It's raps for you. Seriously, look at how big these paleo burrows are. It's as big as a cave, except for it's man-made, or sloth-made. However though, there's an important part I have to point out. It's not likely that these sloths were actually drilling through solid rock like a mining machine. Yes, they were insanely strong and could probably break rock if needed, but weren't actually ripping through pure stone like butter. What they were digging into was soft bedrock and heavily weathered stone. Sandstone, siltstone, volcanic ash, and compacted sediments that look like solid rock today, but were far weaker when they were excavated. Thin rock that can be scraped, fractured, and peeled apart with enough force and leverage, especially among natural cracks. Over tens of thousands of years, those tunnel walls hardened, dried, and lithified even more. Erosion stripped away the softer outer layers, leaving behind smooth, rounded interiors that now give the illusion of precision-drilled stone. That's why geologists were confused for so long. The scratch marks solved it. The gouges matched giant sloth claws in width, spacing, and curvature. Too big for armadillos, too regular for erosion, too organic for tools. Still, an insanely impressive feat, and they look like tunnels that only ancient humans could have dug. But prehistoric sloths' freakish adaptations didn't stop here either. This was Thalassosaurus, the aquatic sloth. This happened in ancient Peru, which was basically a coastal desert. There were no trees to climb and no bushes to eat. The land was empty. But the ocean was an unlimited, all-you-could-eat salad bar of seagrass and kelp. So these sloths evolved to dive. Now you might think, wait, sloths are slow and have fur. Wouldn't they just float like a sad, wet rug? And usually, yes. But evolution gave Thalassosaurus a terrifying upgrade called pagiostosis. Basically, their bones became incredibly dense and heavy. Normally, mammals want light bones to move faster. These guys wanted the opposite. They turned their skeletons into biological distinct diving weights. This allowed them to sink straight to the bottom of the seafloor without struggling against buoyancy, where they would use those massive claws not for climbing trees, but as grappling hooks to anchor themselves to the rocks against the crashing waves. It sounds like a chill life, right? Just hanging at the bottom of the ocean, eating algae. Unfortunately, this was quite possibly the worst existence in history. See, the ancient ocean off the coast of Peru wasn't just water. It was more like a war zone. If you saw our video on our ocean channel, you'd know this was the same neighbourhood patrolled by the Megalodon and Leviathan, a whale that ate other whales. And here is the sloth, swimming in slow motion, trying to eat some grass. Again, while these sloths were definitely strong, Thalassosaurus was definitely not as strong as Megatherium, as they were only around 450 pounds. They're still obviously way bigger than the 11-pound sloths of today, but compare that to a Leviathan who's 100,000 pounds, you didn't stand a chance. We know for a fact that these sloths had a terrible time, because the fossils we find of them are absolutely messed up. Almost every single Thalassosaurus fossil found shows signs of healed fractures. Shin bone snapped in half, ribs shattered, skulls cracked. These guys were getting tossed against jagged rocks by violent waves, or getting crunched by predators, surviving, and then going back into the water to do it all again. They weren't apex predators like the Megatherium, they were the ocean's punching bags. But the fact they survived at all just proves how tough they were. So if these sloths were so overpowered, why'd they go extinct? Well, for the aquatic sloth, it wasn't the sharks or the broken bones that took them out. It was the thermostat. Around 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama closed up, blocking ocean currents. The water off the coast of Peru got drastically colder. The lush seagrass meadows they relied on died off. And since Thalassosaurus had specialised so hard into eating only that specific salad, they starved. They put all their skill points into one build, and then their strategy got completely destroyed. But what about the tanks? What about Megatherium? They survived the cold, they survived the lions, they survived for literal millions of years. So what killed an animal that was effectively invincible? We did. See, around 10,000 years ago, a new predator started rising. Humans. And while we definitely aren't as strong as a bear, and we can't bite through bone, we have one thing that nature had never seen before: projectile weapons. Megatherium was built to fight things that had to get close to hurt it. It had armor skin to stop biting teeth. It had claws to crush skulls within an arm's reach. But it had absolutely no defense against a sharp stick thrown from 30 feet away. When humans arrived in the Americas, these sloths had what scientists call ecological naivety. Basically, they didn't know if they should be scared of us. They saw these tiny, hairless apes and thought, cute, harmless. Every other animal that was our size would just be another random animal they could ignore. Nothing had any weapons besides themselves. We didn't fight fair. We used strategy, traps, and spears to chip away at them until they collapsed. A giant animal that was super slow, couldn't even chase you down, and had tons of meat on it. And because they were so massive and slow to reproduce, once we started eating them, they couldn't repopulate fast enough. You don't need to kill many individuals to collapse a species like that. And unfortunately, about 11,000 years ago, the last of the giant sloths were wiped out, and all that's left are, well, these guys. Still slow, but nothing like what Megatherium was. Being absolutely enormous has huge advantages, but also huge weaknesses. Sloths of today were able to avoid humans, at least avoid well enough to not go extinct. Being a monster made you a target. The ones that hid high up in trees, moved so slowly that they looked like moss, and had so little meat on their bones were the ones that would survive. But don't get it twisted. Just because they shrank doesn't mean they forgot who they used to be. If you look closely at a modern sloth, the monster machinery is actually still there. It's just repackaged in a smaller, furrier box. Sure, they aren't ripping trees out of the ground anymore, but that locking mechanism is identical to the one Megatherium used. And remember how Thalassinus had those dense, unbreakable bones to survive getting smashed against rocks? Modern sloths kept that durability too. Sloths are notoriously clumsy. They mistake their own arms for tree branches all the time and just plummet. We're talking 60 to 90 foot drops straight onto the jungle floor. If a human fell 90 feet, you are leaving in an ambulance. Sloths can just shake that off, and then slowly start the long climb back up. They are surprisingly indestructible because they are still built with the density of their giant ancestors. They became so slow, so boring, and so flavourless that the world just forgot to kill them off. However, there is one predator that even being invisible can't protect you from. Us, again. See, the strategy of looking like a clump of leaves works great against a jaguar. It works terrible against a bulldozer. If we knock down a bunch of trees, sloths won't die from the fall. But now they're an animal slower than a turtle on the ground floor. Basically, the Megatherium if it wasn't a giant tank, which is free food for other predators. But we are also killing the modern sloths by accidentally creating a trap for them. To a sloth, a power line just looks like a long, sturdy vine. It looks like a highway between trees. But when they grab it, they complete the circuit. And because their grip is so strong, the same grip that evolved to rip up trees, they can't let go even when they are being electrocuted. It's a gruesome way to go, and it's happening constantly. And then there is the cuteness factor. Because they move slowly and have markings that make them look like they are permanently smiling, humans have this urge to pick them up. We want to hug them, we want selfies. But that smile isn't actually real, it's just the shape of their skull. In reality, when a human picks up a sloth, that sloth isn't chill. It is in a state of absolute terror. Their heart rate skyrockets, and they can literally die from the stress of being handled, kind of like a mouse. They're too slow to run away, and too weak to fight back, so they just freeze and accept it, until their heart gives out. So we hunted the giants to extinction because they were monsters. And now we might drive the survivors to extinction because we think they're teddy bears. It's not that people are actively hunting sloths for food. They aren't really good food sources anyway, but we are indirectly harming their environment massively. Gigantic or not, I wouldn't think that the sloths on this planet are that fond of us. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Please leave some support and subscribe since we are brand new. And please leave suggestions too. I'm going to be reading every single comment that you guys leave. So if you want to see a video about something, just let me know down below.